All right, today we're going to wrap up our ocean unit. So like on land, the primary source of energy for the life in the ocean is the sun. So just like on land, plants absorb the sun and then they do photosynthesis, and then other animals eat the plants, and then other animals eat those animals, and so that's how we get our food chains. The ocean also has food chains that are mostly dependent on the sun. So oceanographers have divided the ocean into zones that are dependent on where sunlight can reach. Simply, there's a zone where sunlight is and where sunlight isn't. The zone where sunlight is called the photic zone, and the zone where sunlight can't reach because it's too deep is called the aphotic zone. So the photic zone goes all the way from the surface of the ocean to a depth where about only 1% of the original sunlight can reach. Organisms live here, make their own food from sunlight. They use water and carbon dioxide. They do photosynthesis. Or organisms can also live here if they eat organisms that do photosynthesis. Photosynthetic producers form the base of the food chain. So just like on land, grasses and other plants form the base of our food chain, photosynthetic producers also form the base of the food chain in the ocean. So about 90% of all of the marine life, or all of the life in the ocean that we know, is going to live in the photic zone. So very, very, very few organisms are going to live where there is no sunlight or in the aphotic zone. Now, the length of the photic zone depends on quite a few factors, but all of those factors contribute to how cloudy the water is. Obviously, if the water is more cloudy, the photic zone is going to be shallower. If the water is very clear, then the photic zone will be deeper. However, the deepest photic zone measured is 300 meters in depth. So after 300 meters, it's going to be the aphotic zone no matter where we are in the ocean. These are some pictures that are taken in the photic zone. You can tell that this is the photic zone number one because you can see some light reflecting off the surface in this picture. And also we can see color. It turns out you can't actually see color without light. So if you had less than 1% of the sun's light in this area, even if we took a picture, we probably wouldn't see colors because it wouldn't be useful for the organisms in the aphotic zone to have color. One of the things I want you to notice is this is a picture of the fish on top taken in natural light. You'll notice how well this fish blends in with its backgrounds and surroundings. But if we were to light it up with a flashlight, it actually has some different colorations. And so it's meant to live in the zone where not a lot of sunlight is reaching. And so rather than showing up as a variety of colors, it's supposed to show up as kind of like shades of lighter and darker blue, and so it blends in with the background of the ocean much better. Talking briefly about the aphotic zone, the aphotic zone is where virtually no sunlight ever reaches. Life in the aphotic zone, this is pretty gross, but they all get their energy from the remains of organisms that lived in the photic zone. So basically, organisms in the photic zone die, and unlike on land where the organisms die and then they are incorporated into the soil over time as they decay, in the ocean when organisms die, they either sink to the bottom or they get broken up and then little pieces of them sink to the bottom. And so a lot of aphotic zone organisms are scavengers that go ahead and eat the remains of those dead organisms. Some aphotic organisms can make their own light through bioluminescence, and they can use this to attract either a mate or to attract prey, and sometimes both. This is a picture of the aphotic zone. Just kidding, that's a joke. But this is a picture of an organism found in the aphotic zone. So this is something called an anglerfish. You've probably heard of these before, but anglerfish have this little lure here on top. And oops, this lure, I'm going to just kind of highlight it. So this lure here lights up, so it's bioluminescent. Now, normally we wouldn't be able to see most of this fish. To take this picture, they had to shine a very bright light on it, and all these little particles that you can see here, these are all particles that are reflecting that flash that they're using. But this part would normally light up on its own. And organisms are attracted to that little flash of light, and so then they swim close enough to be able to actually get into the anglerfish's mouth. You'll also notice it's kind of hard to see right here in this picture, but the tip of the anglerfish's tongue also glows a little, which can help draw, this particular species can use that to help draw in prey. Let's talk a little bit more about other ocean zones. So the ocean zones can also be divided up based on nutrients and distance from land. And so these zones are going to be called the intertidal zone, the pelagic zone, and the benthic zone. And I'll spend some time going over each of those. By the way, before I move on from the aphotic zone entirely, if you guys are really into the kind of weird and crazy things you can find in the aphotic zone, there's a really good episode of a show called Blue Planet, and all the episodes of Blue Planet are pretty good, but the deep is one called so Blue Planet is broken up into several episodes, and there's one called The Deep, and it's completely about the aphotic zone and all the weird organisms that can be found there. I think that you can watch it on Amazon Prime, maybe Netflix, but I would look it up if you guys have time and want something to watch. I normally show it in class, but this year I won't be able to. All right, so this is just a quick map of the zones that we're going to go over now. So we already went over the photic zone and the aphotic zone. So the photic zone would be the area or the depth that light can shine to. And then the aphotic zone would cover the zone from less than 1% of light all the way down here to where we basically have no light. So let's talk about these three remaining zones. The intertidal zone, if you look at the name, you can actually already break that up. So inter means between, and tidal refers to the tides. So the intertidal zone is the distance between high tide, so right here, and low tide, so out here. So it's the distance that water goes in and out, and so we would call this the intertidal zone. The pelagic zone is the zone that's continuously covered by water, so it goes from low tide out over the open ocean. And then the benthic zone would be the zone along the bottom of the ocean floor. We're going to talk a little bit more about each of those. So the intertidal zone, as I said, is the part that is between the two tides, low tide and high tide. So what's important about organisms that live in the intertidal zone is they have to be able to survive when they're covered with seawater for only part of their lives. So they spend part of the day uncovered, part of the day covered. So organisms in this zone have to be able to be both covered and uncovered with ocean water. These are some examples of intertidal organisms. So here we have some mussels, and then over here starfish. Also a variety of plants are also found in the intertidal zone, but those are just a couple of examples of intertidal organisms. If you've ever been to the beach, you may have actually spent some time hunting for crabs, and they are really great intertidal organisms. You go hunting for them right when it's low tide, and usually at night. That could be pretty fun. The pelagic zone. So the pelagic zone is any part of the earth that's constantly covered by the ocean. So one of the examples I like to use for this is Finding Nemo. So when they're at Finding Nemo and they're in the reef and they get warned, kind of not to swim out to the deep, they live in the pelagic zone, and what they're swimming on is the continental shelf. And then if you remember the continental slope where it goes down more rapidly, that's the part that Nemo's not supposed to swim into, where he goes out and he chases after the boat, right, and gets in big trouble. That's how he goes missing. So, but all of that you see in that movie is in the pelagic zone, meaning it's continuously covered by water. So fish tend to live in that area called the pelagic zone. And just like we saw in Finding Nemo, the quantity of living organisms decreases with the distance from shore. So when he swims out to a certain point, you notice that there's not a whole lot of things alive out there. Whereas when they're in the school and the reef, you know, you can see there's hundreds of fish and all kinds of plants and corals and all those sorts of things. So usually the closer you get to shore, the more variety of living organisms and the higher number of living organisms you have. Now, the benthic zone is going to include any part of the ocean near the bottom of the ocean. So what you'll notice is if we go back to our map and we actually look at these, you can pick areas where you have lots of overlap. So for example, if we were going to pick this area here, this is intertidal photic benthic zone. So it applies to 3, okay? Whereas if we were out here, you know, and we pick a spot along the floor down here, now we're in the pelagic aphotic benthic zone. So it's usually something is in at least 2 zones. It can also sometimes be in 3 zones. So 90% of the marine life in the ocean is found where the benthic zone waters overlap the photic zone. And part of this is because we have things like coral reefs, which have huge biodiversity, which means they can have thousands of different organisms living in this one little location. So most of the marine life that we have discovered that we know of is found where those 2 zones overlap. So basically the ocean is shallow and the light is able to shine through. We can have a variety of plant life, corals, things that attach to the bottom of the ocean. We can have fish, all kinds of things. And the reason is there's lots of nutrients in that part of the ocean. In the deepest parts of the benthic zone, we find organisms that live without relying on the sun. So we find these things called hydrothermal vents, which pump extremely hot water into the bottom of the ocean. And these support things called extremophiles. And so hydrothermal vents, what are they? Basically, it's water that's heated by the planet's interior. If you have ever been to Yellowstone National Park to see the geysers, like Old Faithful, those are essentially the same thing, except for that these are underwater. And because they're underwater, all the ocean water pressurizes them. And so the water can get super, super hot, much hotter than it could get on land, right? So on land, water boils at 212 degrees Celsius, so it can't get much hotter than that. But down at, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius is what the temperature that it boils at. So it can't get a lot hotter than that. If it does get hotter than that, it just boils off and becomes steam. However, under the ocean, it can get to be about 450 degrees Celsius, which is very close to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So organisms that live near hydrothermal vents need to be able to survive a high heat, and also to be able to live in this acidic environment. Because when the water comes out of the interior of the earth, it dissolves a lot of chemicals, and that is going to cause the water to become acidic over time. So you'll see a bunch of cool organisms that live there. Bacteria that do chemosynthesis, giant tube worms, which you can look at pictures of those if you want. There's an organism called the Yeti crab that survives on the bacteria that live on the giant tube worms. So they have their whole kind of own ecosystem down there. We talked about abyssal plains and mid-ocean ridges, which are large flats, the abyssal plains are the large flat spots under the ocean. They're mostly uninhabited. So you can sort of think of it like a giant desert under the ocean. And that's because there's not a lot of food supply there, so not many things can live there. This is a picture of one of those hydrothermal vents that I was just talking about. And this is one that is recently erupted, and so it didn't have a lot of life on it. But over time, what will happen is these are those giant tube worms that will grow. Bacteria will grow on there. And then this is the Yeti crab that will feed on those bacteria. And something kind of cool about the design of the Yeti crab is you can see all these little white hairs, right, all over the Yeti crab's arms, and which is why it gets its name. It looks like the Yeti or the abominable snowman to people. And these little hairs are actually useful for the crab. They help the crab to catch those bacteria that I was telling you do chemosynthesis, and then that's what the crab lives on. So these little hairs are actually used to help them catch food, which is pretty neat. This is another thing that can live down in this area. It's a special kind of sea cucumber. It's pretty cool. And yet, here's another thing that can live on the abyssal. So these are two things that can live on the abyssal plains that we were just talking about. This is called the umbrella octopus or the Dumbo octopus. I think somebody has this organism as one of their organisms. And then this is a starfish sea cucumber. This guy is kind of cool because he can throw himself in the air and then like twirl around and land somewhere else to get more food, which is pretty neat. But these are all organisms that tend to live in places where other things are not very good at surviving. All right, so now I'm going to talk to you about the 3 kinds of marine life, and this is something that you need to know for your poster project. So we don't know exactly how many species there are in the ocean, but we think there's at least 250, so we know that there are at least 250,000. Okay, so 250,000 different species, and we estimate that there's about 1 million undiscovered species in the ocean. So we had to come up with a way of categorizing all of those species, and so scientists divided them up into 3 very general categories, which are plankton, nekton, and benthos. These 3 categories are going to be partially determined by where the animal lives and partially determined by how it moves. So let's discuss plankton first. Plankton are organisms that move around by floating with the ocean current. They are unable to swim against the ocean current. Many plankton are really small and often microscopic. So they'll include microscopic plants, animals, and bacteria in the ocean water. There are, however, large plankton. So a jellyfish would be an example of a large plankton. For example, the largest species of jellyfish can grow up to 120 feet long. So that would be a pretty large plankton. Seahorses would be another example of plankton. Seahorses can move around, but if they get swept into a current, they would not be able to swim against the current. And so that would be the measure of whether it's a plankton or a nekton, is can it swim against a current. We have 2 kinds of plankton generally in the ocean. We have plankton that photosynthesize. Those are called phytoplankton. So you can think of those sort of like the plant plankton. And animals that are floating with the ocean current are called zooplankton. So zooplankton are anything that eats other things for nutrients if they don't make their own food from sunlight, and they also can float with the currents. They can't swim against them. So we have phytoplankton, which are the ones that do photosynthesis, and then zooplankton, which is anything that eats something else. The marker for all plankton is that they can't swim against that ocean current, so they just kind of float along in the ocean. Here's a couple examples of plankton. So down here we have what's called the lion's mane jellyfish, and then up here we have what are called diatoms. You guys may remember that we looked at diatoms in 5th grade as an example of an algae, so they're just a really cool looking microscopic algae. Next category that we have is nekton. Nekton are sea creatures that are capable of swimming against the current. Nekton are usually fish. They also can include mollusks, which are squid, and mammals such as whales and dolphins. They can move anywhere in the ocean, but often they stay in a particular region of the ocean, and they kind of just inhabit that one region. They do often migrate though. So for example, a lot of whales migrate. One specific special example we talked about when we talked about the Mariana Trench is the sperm whale, which can dive about 3 kilometers. So it can go up to the surface and then go ahead and go back down almost 2 miles beneath the surface. So these would all be examples of nekton. I'm not going to show you pictures of nekton because we've seen a lot of fish. We all know what a whale and a dolphin and a squid look like. So you can probably visualize nekton pretty easily. So that leaves us with our last category. Our final category are the benthos. And this is anything that lives on the bottom of the ocean floor. So actually on the bottom or very near to the bottom. So benthos include plants because plants need to be attached to the bottom. So if you think about things like kelp forest, the kelp is actually rooted into the ground. Crustaceans, which crawl along the bottom, sponges, which are also attached to the bottom. Things like mollusks, like hermit crabs that live actually in shells, corals, which are attached to the bottom. So all of these things that either crawl along the bottom or are actually physically attached to the bottom are going to be called benthos. Benthos can be found at all depths, but they stay in whatever depth they're at usually. So benthos aren't moving around a lot, but you find different types of benthos at different depths in the ocean. Benthos that live in the aphotic zone, we already talked about this, are primarily scavengers, and they feed entirely on what we would call detritus. Detritus is the remains of other organisms that float down in the ocean due to gravity and then collect on the bottom, and then scavengers can eat those remains. Here are a few examples of benthos that you might see. So this is a picture of a kelp forest. The kelp forest, the way it works, right, is that the plant is attached to the bottom of the floor, but then they grow these little air sacs near their leaves, and the air sacs actually carry the kelp plant and help it float so that the tops of the plants are close enough to the surface to be able to do photosynthesis. This is a crazy one. This is called a Japanese spider crab. I'm not going to tell you too much about this one because someone has it as their ocean organism, so I'll let them fill you in on all the fun details. But this is not an abnormally large Japanese spider crab. This is the traditional size that they generally grow to. But any crab would be an example of a benthos, anything that crawls along the bottom. So think crab, shrimp, lobster, those kinds of things. This is a type of coral, so all types of coral would be benthos. And then this is a giant clam. The giant clam is one of my favorite benthos organisms. These guys can weigh up to about 250 pounds when they're alive, so that's quite a large clam. You can see how big the shell is right there. Here's a variety of sponges, corals, those kinds of things. Those would all be examples of benthos. This is a shot of what that reef would look like from the air. So you can see here, this would be a large, shallow region where we could have lots and lots of benthos. And the end. So that wraps up our ocean unit. I hope you guys got everything that you needed to do your ocean project from that unit. If you have any questions, please feel free to hop on Zoom or send me an email.